good morning, evening, or night. Wherever you are, welcome to WHAM today. Take a deep breath, clear your mind, and let's drift through the whispers of today's world, one quiet thought at a time. As we wrap up Thursday, 15th May 2025, let's see what stories are unfolding around us. United States and China have agreed to temporarily reduce tariffs, offering a glimmer of hope in their trade relations. The new U.S. ambassador to China, former senator and business executive David Perdue, has arrived in Beijing. Soybeans, a leading U.S. export to China, have yet to recover from the previous trade war. Manufacturers like Apple and Samsung increased shipments ahead of the announcement of new tariffs. The U.S. is considering a deal to turn Gaza into a freedom zone. President Trump is set to visit a U.S. installation in the Middle East as part of a 4-day visit to Gulf states, rejecting past interventionism. Trump is also laying the groundwork for a potential $20 trillion pledge with a Gulf nation. Furthermore, Trump's announcement that the U.S. will ease sanctions on Syria could facilitate the country's recovery. The Supreme Court is set to hear a birthright citizenship dispute, potentially leading to varying citizenship rules across states. Donald Trump's pick for head of OSHA, David Keeling, is expected to weaken protections against extreme heat for workers. US watchdogs are considering reducing capital requirements for banks, potentially rolling back post-crisis protections in line with Trump's deregulation efforts. Over 1,000 U.S. students have been punished for their speech since 2020, indicating increased university willingness to penalize student expression. Parker Hovis, for example, was suspended from the University of Florida after a pro-Palestine protest. Ksenia Petrova, a Russian Harvard scientist, was charged with smuggling frog embryos into the U.S. and faces deportation. US crypto investors contributed millions of dollars to Trump's election victory. The governor of Guam is advocating for economic diversification to position the island as a logistics and defense hub in the Indo-Pacific. Besides, El Salvador, where the United States has already sent detainees, Rwanda and Libya have records of mistreating migrant detainees. Turning to Russia, Grigory Melkonian's 44, co-chair of the Russian vote monitoring, Ingo Golos, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for working with an undesirable organization in relation to his watchdog's past affiliation with the European election monitoring group. President Vladimir Putin was not on Russia's team for talks in Turkey with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, instead naming a lower-level team for the meeting. Putin has stated, "We have reason to believe that we are set to finish them off regarding Ukraine, with Moscow believing it is winning and can play hardball diplomatically." The Japanese government has lodged a protest with Russia over planned drills near Shikotan. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky described the Russian delegation sent for talks in Turkey as decorative. Ahead of Istanbul talks, Russia ignored ceasefire calls and showed signs of preparing new offensives in Ukraine. Day 176 of Russia's war on Ukraine saw key events. Zelensky will be in Turkey, but Putin is not on Russia's team for the first direct Moscow-Kyiv talks since 2022. German authorities are investigating 3 Ukrainian nationals for an alleged plot to send explosive devices to addresses in Ukraine suspected of planning to sabotage commercial freight infrastructure. Washington sees costly, incremental gains in Ukraine and an unrealistic negotiating position from Russia. Moving to Syria, discussion of a meeting between Donald Trump and Syria's President Ahmad al-Sharaa in Saudi Arabia was the culmination of months of diplomacy by the Syrians, as well as their Turkish and Saudi allies who believed FaceTime with Trump would help end Syria's international isolation, writes William Christou. President Donald Trump's announcement that the U.S. will ease sanctions on Syria could eventually facilitate the country's recovery from years of civil war and transform the lives of everyday Syrians. In China, The new U.S. ambassador, former senator and business executive David Perdue, has arrived in Beijing as the country and the U.S. reach a temporary break in the damaging tariff war. The move comes a day after fresher sanctions on Iranian oil sales to China under Trump's maximum pressure campaign. Manufacturers such as Apple and Samsung increased shipments ahead of its announcement of new tariffs. Soybeans, a leading U.S. export to China, have yet to recover from President Trump's first-term trade war, industry chief tells senators. Focusing on El Salvador, inmates are housed at the mega-prison known as Secar in Tecoluca.I. Besides El Salvador, where the United States has already sent detainees, Rwanda and Libya have records of mistreating migrant detainees. Finally, in Mexico, the government has confirmed reports that 17 family members of the son of a former cartel leader crossed into the United States. China is navigating a complex economic and geopolitical landscape, facing trade tensions with the U.S., while seeking to strengthen ties with other nations. The country is urging tech platforms to support self-employed vendors in response to U.S. tariffs and strategically leveraging its rare earth mineral resources. APEC warns export growth in the Asia-Pacific region will be minimal due to U.S. tariffs and shipments valued under $800 arriving in the United States from China and Hong Kong may face a 54% tariff. China is also actively expanding its international influence, aiming for a golden decade in relations with Latin America and the Caribbean by supporting free trade and a more democratic international system amid competition with the U.S. As part of this effort, China is extending visa-free travel to 5 Latin American nations following a summit with a regional bloc. China and the U.S. signed dueling deals following a trade war truce, with Beijing investing in Brazil and Washington in the Middle East. Domestically, China's car exports to Russia have sharply reversed due to Moscow tightening trade policies and rising geopolitical risks. J.com its losses deepened in its new businesses segment in the first quarter, amid the e-commerce giant's costly push into China's highly competitive food delivery sector. China Vanke has received a US $215 loan from a state-owned stakeholder as it faces us $3.40 billion in debt obligations this year. A hospital scandal is eroding public trust in the healthcare system, following controversies over inadequate training and the use of cheap medications. Chinese researchers are facing challenges due to an incentive system that favors titles over innovation, hindering academic support for groundbreaking ideas. To address technological limitations, China is launching satellites to create the world's first supercomputer in orbit, aiming to improve data retrieval. Cartel is pursuing an overseas expansion with a US $4.60 billion Hong Kong IPO, signaling Beijing's commitment to promoting China's EV technologies globally. Investment banks are upgrading China's growth forecasts, and there's an increase in overseas visitors to Shenzhen. A party journal suggests that China can establish an effective market stabilization fund, acknowledging Central Huijin Investment's role. Starbucks has begun exploring the sale of a stake in its extensive China business amid slowing growth. China-Philippine relations face uncertainty as President Marcos struggles to counter the Duta camp, potentially forcing a recalibration of China policy. Turning to the United Kingdom, China has cautioned the UK regarding its new trade agreement with the US, alleging that Britain is siding with the US in a way that could force British companies to exclude Chinese products from their supply chain. Meanwhile, in the United States, the country is engaged in trade tensions with China, marked by the implementation of tariffs and strategic competition for global influence. Despite a tariff truce, both nations have signed dueling investment deals, with Beijing investing in Brazil and Washington in the Middle East. The U.S. is also seeing Chinese institutions recruiting China-born researchers from the U.S. with attractive pay packages, targeting scientists affected by funding cuts and increased scrutiny. The U.S. will not win a trade war with China. Across the Atlantic, The European Union has indicated it is not interested in reviving stalled investment deals with China and prefers focusing on Brussels' concerns about issues like overcapacity. Finally, in Hong Kong, billion-dollar Hong Kong IPOs are continuing as Jiangsu Hengrui Pharmaceuticals joins Singapore-based Mirxes in a revitalized market listing surge. India has blocked X accounts belonging to state media from China and Turkey, citing disinformation concerns related to recent military actions, while also calling for UN and IAEA scrutiny of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal due to ongoing tensions. India also claims its Air Force bypassed and jammed Pakistan's Chinese-supplied air defense system. Economically, Apple intends to increase its production in India, but this plan faces potential disruption from former U.S. President Trump, who is urging Apple to limit production in India due to high tariffs. Indigenous women in India are creating dream maps to protect their lands from climate change's impact. Amid the tensions, Pakistan's nuclear weapons program is facing renewed scrutiny after India's call for UNIAIR, moderated by concerns over regional stability. In the United States, former President Trump's repeated offers to mediate between India and Pakistan have been received poorly by Indian leaders. Trump also urged Apple CEO Tim Cook to limit production in India and increase manufacturing in the U.S., citing tariff concerns. Badar Khan Suri, an Indian student and Georgetown University postdoctoral fellow, was released from ICE detention following a judge's order. China has seen its state media X accounts blocked in India due to disinformation concerns. Apple is additionally planning to move production from China to India. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to meet with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. The meeting will focus on the possibility of renewed talks with Russia in Istanbul, marking the first meeting between Ukrainian and Russian representatives since the early weeks of the invasion. Zelensky has expressed dissatisfaction with Russia's delegation, calling them decorative, and noting that Vladimir Putin will not attend despite Zelensky's invitation for a face-to-face discussion in Istanbul. Turning to the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced plans for return hubs in other countries for rejected asylum seekers. This initiative includes increased collaboration with Albania's Prime Minister Edi Rama to combat people smugglers. The UK is also exploring new visa options for investors in key industries, alongside efforts to lower overall immigration. Starmer condemned recent arson attacks on properties connected to him, denouncing them as an attack on democracy. The UK economy has shown strong growth, recording its fastest pace in a year during the first quarter of 2025, which has provided a boost for the Labour government. Labour MP Kim Leadbeater challenged claims that the Royal College of Psychiatrists does not support the assisted dying bill, asserting that there is sufficient support among psychiatrists. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has criticised the UK's invitation to Donald Trump for a second state visit, saying that it weakens the united front against Trump's remarks about a nexus in Canada. Japan is navigating a multifaceted economic environment, with Mizuho forecasting record earnings for fiscal 2025 amid global trade uncertainties and U.S. tariff policy. The nation seeks a 1% real wage increase in 5 years, dependent on sustaining a 2% inflation rate. Wealthy Japanese households remain cautious about a potential yen crash, remembering the market collapse of the early 1990s. To combat a declining birth rate, Japan intends to fully subsidize childbirth costs, potentially starting in April 2026. Policy shifts and societal developments are evident. Amended laws will allow over-the-counter drug sales in convenience stores within 2 years. Uber plans to introduce self-driving mobility services in Japan, pending partner firms' readiness. Illegal wagers on overseas sports betting sites have risen to over $6.4 trillion, prompting legal examination of some baseball players. Sao Ishikawa became the first severely disabled author to win a major literary award in Japan for her novel Hunchback. Japan is confronting several difficulties. Japan display will eliminate 1,500 jobs due to financial troubles, reporting a significant net loss for fiscal 2024. The Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, continues its search for 2 missing crew members from a crashed Air Self-Defense Force, ASDF, training jet. The Japanese government inspected the U.S. Yokota Air Base due to concerns about a possible FAS chemical leak. A Kyoto guest house faced criticism and protest from the Israeli envoy for asking Israeli guests to declare they have never committed war crimes. Concerning international relations, Japan will hold a third round of trade discussions with the U.S. next week, with Ryusei Akazawa possibly traveling to Washington. Japan is worried about the possible effects of a U.S.-UK trade agreement on its tariff negotiations, especially given Washington's existing 10% tariff on UK imports. The head of Japanese American Museum has criticized Trump-led funding cuts to the National Endowment for the Humanities, which supports museums. Saudi Arabia finds itself strategically positioned between the United States and China, leveraging substantial agreements, including U.S. $600 billion worth secured during Donald Trump's presidency. The U.S. has also emphasized Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations as economic models. Elon Musk showcased Tesla, Optimus robots to Donald Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and also announced a Starlink deal within the country. The United States, under President Trump, redefined its foreign policy approach, especially in the Middle East, by halting lectures on how to live and criticizing Western intervention. Trump's tour included a visit to the main U.S. military base and an investment conference in Riyadh, promoting Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar as economic examples. The U.S. also pursued Iran's compliance regarding its nuclear program. Simultaneously, potential conflicts of interest emerged, as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, all part of President Trump's Middle East itinerary, had recent investments in Trump's businesses. Australia is focused on strengthening ties with its neighbors and addressing domestic environmental concerns. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met with Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto to discuss enhanced economic and defense cooperation. He also voiced support for Australian citizen Yang Hengjun, convicted of espionage in China. Greens leader Larissa Waters is pushing for stronger environmental policies. An Australian seaweed farm is innovating to reduce methane emissions from livestock. Marion Joan Pearson, a former financial advisor with New Zealand citizenship, will be extradited to Australia to face numerous theft charges. Turning to Indonesia, President Prabowo Subianto's meeting with Australian Prime Minister Albanese signals a growing strategic partnership between the two nations. The discussions centered on deepening economic ties and strengthening defense collaboration in the region. Indonesia is keen to foster closer relationships with key regional players like Australia. In China, the conviction of Australian citizen Yang Hengjun on espionage charges continues to strain relations with Australia. The Australian government has expressed serious concerns about the fairness and transparency of the legal proceedings. This case has become a significant point of contention between the two countries. Palestinians are observing the 77th anniversary of the Nakba, linking the events of 1948 to their present-day circumstances in Gaza and the West Bank. Amid this commemoration, Israeli military operations in Gaza have caused the deaths of at least 103 Palestinians, even as the Israeli far right has called for an assault on the occupied West Bank. The Israeli military has escalated its bombardment of the Gaza Strip, resulting in at least 80 Palestinian deaths. Airstrikes in northern Gaza led to numerous casualties, with the Indonesian hospital in Beit Lahia overwhelmed. Israel has directed residents to evacuate sections of Gaza City as these attacks intensify. Dozens were killed overnight in airstrikes, marking the second consecutive night of intense bombing. Israel also targeted Mohammed Sinwar, a key Hamas leader in Gaza, for assassination. While his death could deprive Hamas of a top commander, it might not fundamentally change the group's overall strategy. Aid organizations and UN investigations have accused Israel of intentionally targeting and destroying Gaza's health infrastructure, an accusation that has resurfaced following a strike near the European hospital. A recent IPC report indicates that nearly 500,000 people in Gaza are now facing starvation due to Israel's restrictions on humanitarian aid entering the area. South Korea recently saw Premier League star Son Heung-min targeted in a blackmail plot. 2 individuals were arrested for allegedly demanding millions of won, threatening to fabricate claims of pregnancy. Son's agency, Son and Football Limited, confirmed his victim status. In other news, Lee Jae-myung, a former presidential candidate, inadvertently triggered a consumer frenzy. His wearing of bipartisan blue and red Reeboks, symbolizing unity, resulted in the shoes quickly selling out and fetching inflated prices. Sukmyung Women's University is considering retroactively revoking former First Lady Kim Keon-hee's master's degree amid plagiarism accusation. The nation's complex history also continues to shape its present, as many South Koreans remain hesitant about engaging in joint military exercises with Japanese troops. The entertainment industry also faces challenges, including delays and financial setbacks stemming from controversies involving figures like Kim Soo-hyun-dol. Following the lifting of U.S. sanctions, Syria saw celebrations erupt, particularly in Aleppo. Business owners and residents expressed hope for economic renewal and rebuilding the war-torn economy. The country is emerging from a civil war, which has deeply affected its diverse population. Minority groups, such as the Druze near the Israeli border, are also navigating the post-conflict landscape. In a significant diplomatic move, the United States saw President Trump meeting with Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. This marked the first meeting between U.S. and Syrian leaders in 25 years. Trump cited the crippling impact of the sanctions as his rationale for lifting them. During the meeting, Trump urged al-Shara to normalize ties with Israel, signaling a potential shift in regional dynamics. Poland's political landscape is set for a significant shift as the presidential election approaches, offering a chance to potentially undo the conservative agenda championed by outgoing President Andrzej Duda. The contest is largely seen as a critical judgment on recent populist movements, with Rafał Trzaskowski, the progressive mayor of Warsaw, standing as a strong contender for the presidential office. The current centrist coalition hopes to capitalize on this election to tackle democratic erosion and possibly make good on pledges, including revising the nation's stringent abortion regulations, which have been in effect for half a decade and are viewed by activists as virtually a complete prohibition. Pakistan recently received a $1.02 billion disbursement from the IMF after previous delays related to security issues, and conversations about the country's next budget are ongoing. Regarding international relations, Pakistan has signaled its openness to resuming discussions with India about the Indus Waters Treaty, ADT. Notably, there was no reference to recent aerial incidents or disagreements over water distribution in the state. In Balochistan province, a historic appointment occurred with the naming of the first Hindu woman as Assistant Commissioner, which Chief Minister Bhakti celebrated as a moment of national significance. The IEA verified that there were no radiation leaks at any of Pakistan's nuclear sites. A human rights organization expressed apprehension about the eviction of Christian residents in Punjab by land mafia, leading to the HRCP launching a fact-finding mission to investigate the matter. The United States is experiencing a significant downturn in relations with South Africa, reaching levels not seen since the end of apartheid. This deterioration is largely attributed to the Trump administration's decision to offer refugee status to white Afrikaners claiming persecution in South Africa. President Trump has publicly stated his belief that terrible things are happening there, further inflaming the situation. Adding to the complexity, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has strongly criticized Afrikaners seeking refuge in the U.S., branding them as cowardly for abandoning their homeland. President Ramaphosa is scheduled to meet with President Trump in the U.S. soon, a meeting fraught with tension due to these recent events. In other news from South Africa, a gecko species thought to be extinct was recently found alive in a remote canyon, marking its rediscovery after 34 years. Turkey is grappling with a middle power dilemma as its transactional foreign policy faces rising costs. To address European security, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and NATO diplomats met in Turkey to prepare for an upcoming summit. Domestically, the Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK, has agreed to suspend its armed conflict with the Turkish state, sparking debate about the group's future role and Turkey's political climate. For the upcoming Ukraine peace talks in Turkey, President Vladimir Putin will send a hardline aide to lead the Russian delegation instead of attending personally. In aviation news, Turkey will fine airline passengers $67 for unbuckling their seatbelts too early and rushing to deplane after landing. The United States has decided to maintain limits on 2 common fast chemicals in tap water, while the EPA will ease restrictions on 4 other fast chemicals. Seeking refuge. A group of Afrikaners claiming persecution in South Africa have been granted refugee status by the Trump administration and have arrived in the United States. The United States will also see an increase in beef exports to the United Kingdom, thanks to a new trade agreement, though some British consumers are worried about American food production standards. In China, rare earth magnet producers are restarting shipments to foreign markets, but under tight regulatory control, causing prices for these magnets to rise in both Europe and the United States. New Zealand witnessed a rare interaction as footage surfaced of a taka bird chasing and nipping at a tuatara reptile on Territory Matandi Island, captured by conservation ranger Nick Fizentsidis. Moreover, New Zealand's parliament is deliberating the suspension of 3 MPs, Debbie Ngarapacker, Rawiri Wataiti, and Hannah Rawiti Maipi Clark, from Te Peti Im Ori, following their Haka protest against the Treaty Principles Bill in November 2020. Iran is seeking expertise from India's cheetah conservation efforts to combat the dwindling numbers of its own cheetah population, which is threatened by habitat loss and reduced prey. Meanwhile, former President Trump has declared that any future nuclear accord with Iran must stipulate an end to its backing of proxy organizations, adding that the U.S. is close to reaching a nuclear agreement. Adding a cultural note, Iranian-American novelist Nahid Rachlan, known for her works exploring the cultural divide between East and West, has died at 85. Her debut novel was Foreigner. Qatar became the focal point of President Trump's diplomatic efforts as he sought the nation's help in convincing Iran to relinquish its nuclear ambitions, leveraging Qatar's established role as a mediator between the United States and Iran. During this visit, Mukesh Ambani had a meeting with President Trump in Doha, marking their second interaction since Trump assumed office, the first being during Trump's 2020 visit to India. The visit to Doha comes at a time when the emirate is actively trying to rehabilitate its global image, especially after previous allegations of being a source of funding for terrorism. Mexico is grappling with persistent security issues and tragic events. A major highway accident linking Oaxaca and Puebla states led to at least 21 deaths. Violence against women remains a pressing concern, highlighted by the shooting of TikTok influencer Valeria Marquez, 23, in Jalisco, during a live stream. Adding to the complexities, Mexico's security secretary suggested that members of El Chapo's family crossed into the U.S., seemingly as part of an arrangement with the previous Trump administration. Bolivia is currently facing political turmoil as former President Evo Morales hides in the Chapare jungle, shielded by armed loyalists. Morales is controversially seeking a fourth presidential term, despite constitutional limits. President Luis Arce, once Morales' political protege, has withdrawn from the race, signaling declining support. France is currently seeing its Prime Minister François Bayrou facing an inquiry related to alleged abuse at a Catholic school, where he is accused of concealing critical information. In a tit-for-tat exchange, France is expelling Algerian diplomats, signaling worsening relations between the two nations. The Gérard Depardieu case verdict is viewed as a pivotal moment for the #MeToo movement in France, possibly indicating increased judicial attention to sexual violence cases. Argentina's President Javier Milei has implemented stricter immigration policies through a recent decree. The decree limits access to residency and citizenship, but it also expedites the deportation of foreign nationals who break the law. These measures are seen by some as mirroring policies previously enacted by the Trump administration in the United States. Germany's new leadership under Chancellor Friedrich Merz is charting a course of significant policy changes. A core domestic objective is transforming the Bundeswehr into what Merz envisions as the strongest conventional army in Europe. Internationally, Germany is adopting a strategy of strategic de-risking from China, driven by Chancellor Merz's stated great concern regarding China's deepening ties with Russia. Separately, German police apprehended 3 Ukrainian nationals suspected of involvement in a Russian sabotage operation. The alleged plot involved explosive devices originating from Germany, intended for use in Ukraine. El Salvador is currently witnessing President Nayib Bukele facing increasing criticism regarding his administration's concentration of authority, notably through a suggested foreign agent statute. This bill has sparked considerable apprehension among critics, who fear it will suppress civil society organizations and independent journalism. The situation is further complicated by the substantial business connections of Howard Lutnick, a former Commerce Secretary under the Trump administration, and his family, which have ties to Bukele with specific reference to the cryptocurrency Tether. Taiwan is facing escalating energy needs due to the growth of its AI industry, leading to renewed debate on nuclear energy as its final nuclear reactor nears decommissioning. Simultaneously, Taiwan has reported heightened paramilitary maneuvers occurring alongside Taiwanese defense drills. In an unrelated matter, Taiwanese singer Nine Chen is among several celebrities under scrutiny for allegedly using fabricated medical documents to avoid compulsory military service. Thailand recently faced challenges related to illicit activities and environmental concerns. At the port of Bangkok, authorities seized 238 tons of illegally imported electronic waste from the U.S., highlighting the country's battle against such imports. The nation is also dealing with wildlife trafficking as seen by the arrest of a man smuggling baby orangutans. This points to Thailand's position as a hub for wildlife smugglers. In a separate local incident, residents discovered a monitor lizard consuming the remains of a newborn, leading to a police investigation to find the infant's mother. Singapore's recent election data indicates a roughly 47% approval rate among Gen Z voters, a figure that trails behind older demographics. Separately, a disruptive passenger aboard a Scoot flight faced imprisonment for their actions. In higher education news, both Singapore's National University of Singapore, NUS, and China's Tsinghua University are being recognized as top-tier institutions worldwide in terms of generating wealthy alumni. Romania is preparing for a heated presidential election following a controversial annulment. George Simeon, a prominent nationalist candidate, championing a Make Romania Great Again agenda, opposes military aid to Ukraine and criticizes the European Union. Al Jazeera has interviewed key candidates as political tensions rise. Turning to France, President Emmanuel Macron is facing renewed scrutiny over pension reforms. Nationwide protests continue, with unions threatening further strikes if the government does not reconsider raising the retirement age. The reforms are aimed at ensuring the long-term viability of the pension system, but critics argue they disproportionately affect lower-income workers. Meanwhile, in Germany, a debate is raging over energy policy. The government is under pressure to reduce its reliance on Russian gas and is exploring alternative sources of energy, including nuclear power. However, there is significant public opposition to nuclear energy, raising questions about the country's future energy mix. In the latest from Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is grappling with rising inflation. The Bank of Canada has raised interest rates in an attempt to curb inflation, but the move has sparked concerns about a potential recession. The government is also facing pressure to address housing affordability, particularly in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Malaysia is facing a crisis as thousands of Bangladeshi workers are stranded, unemployed, and becoming illegal overstayers because of a hiring freeze. Adding to the country's concerns, Thomas Harting Siu, the husband of Pamela Lane, a key witness who has vanished in a corruption investigation, was arrested concerning corruption and money laundering. Brazil is grappling with the persistent issue of cattle laundering, even as its slaughterhouses make strides in distancing themselves from Amazon deforestation. Meanwhile, President Lula has committed to urging Russian President Putin to engage in peace talks with Ukrainian President Zelensky. In Istanbul, Canada is grappling with a severe wildfire in central Manitoba, leading to the tragic deaths of 2 individuals and the displacement of 1,000 residents. Exacerbated by unusually hot, dry, and windy weather, the fire has sparked warnings of a potentially catastrophic fire season across the region. Serbia saw student activists travel to Brussels to protest corruption and promote democracy before the European Union. Simultaneously, a hotel venture linked to Trump and Kushner in Belgrade faced setbacks amid accusations of falsifying documents to allow demolition on a protected property. Albania's Prime Minister Edi Rama expressed gratitude to voters for a decisive victory and committed to securing EU membership for the Balkan nation by 2030. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen echoed this sentiment, affirming that Albania belongs in EU and lauded Rama's re-election. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's decision regarding Afghanistan could lead to over 9,000 refugees being forced to return to the Taliban-controlled country after the termination of their temporary protected status. Bangladesh is currently facing heightened uncertainty due to a ban on Prime Minister Hasina Zawahiri League, which has further strained relations with India and raised concerns about democratic freedoms within the country. Cambodia and China have commenced their largest joint military exercise to date, named Golden Dragon, which includes operations across land, sea, and air. China's influence continues to expand, with Colombia recently joining the Belt and Road Initiative, solidifying China's position as the largest trading partner for numerous Latin American nations. Hungary has also voiced its commitment to maintaining strong economic and trade relations with China, even if pressured by the United States to decouple. Colombia's decision to join China's Belt and Road Initiative underscores China's increasing economic sway, surpassing the United States as the primary trading partner for several Latin American countries. Fiji commemorates the 146th anniversary of the arrival of the first indentured laborers from British India. France's President Emmanuel Macron is reportedly willing to initiate discussions regarding the potential deployment of French nuclear weapons within European countries, contingent upon certain conditions. Hungary has firmly stated its intention to maintain its relationship with China, even under potential pressure from the United States, citing the benefits derived from robust economic and trade ties. Iceland's population largely views former President Trump's interest in Greenland and the Arctic as a threat to their nation, with approximately 74% expressing this concern in a recent poll. Indonesia is embroiled in controversy following President Prabowo Subianto's assertion that Bill Gates is developing a tuberculosis vaccine intended for testing within Indonesia. Ireland continues to celebrate Christy Moore, an iconic figure in Irish folk music who, at 80 years old, maintains a devoted following and a profound connection to his music. In Kosovo, children with hearing impairments encounter significant obstacles in their education, primarily due to inadequate resources and a lack of sign language support for parents. Libya's capital has been shaken by renewed gun battles between two powerful armed groups, just a day after authorities had declared an end to previous fighting. Montenegro was commended by European Council President Antonio Costa for its advancements towards EU membership, highlighting it as a fine example of progress and momentum in the enlargement process. Palestine commemorates Nakba Day on May 15th, a day marking the ethnic cleansing that occurred in Palestine in 1948. Photographs serve as a reminder of the places, people, and daily lives that existed before the Nakba. Qatar's Al Udeid Air Base continues to be a pivotal hub for U.S. air operations, playing a crucial role across a vast area spanning from Northeast Africa to Central and South Asia. Spain experienced an explosion at a chemical plant near Seville, prompting the issuance of warnings to thousands of local residents. Sri Lanka is grappling with period poverty, where some girls in the hill country are forced to miss classes during their menstrual cycles due to a lack of access to affordable sanitary products. Switzerland, as the host of the Eurovision competition, relies on a discreet Swiss organization to manage the event and mitigate potential controversies that could disrupt the competition. Tonga has reported new cases of dengue fever. The United Kingdom is dealing with the case of Bella Cully, an 18-year-old British teenager detained in a prison in Tbilisi, Georgia, on suspicion of drug offenses after initial concerns that she had gone missing in Thailand. In the United States, Qatar's Al Udeid Air Base plays a vital role as a hub for U.S. air operations across a wide region from Northeast Africa to Central and South Asia. The Trump administration's policy change regarding Afghanistan could force over 9,000 refugees to return to the Taliban-ruled country. Furthermore, a heart-rending story unfolded as a 2-year-old girl was reunited with her mother in Venezuela after a period of separation caused by the mother's deportation from the U.S. And that's a wrap for today's news, because even headlines need a nap. Stay curious, stay kind, and let the noise fade as you find your quiet. Take care, stay awesome, and I'll see you next time on WHAM Today.